Welcome to Westview Cemetery. Before you are markers of granite, monuments of marble. For each stone there was a life, and for each life there is a story. Tales of heartbreak and heroism, failure and faith, love, laughter, and loss. Today, we'd like to share with you a few of those stories. To find the stops on this tour, you'll need the accompanying map, which can be downloaded from www.moultriega.com and printed. Each time you hear this tone, stop your player and follow the directions on the map to the next marker before playing the next track. The stop numbers match the track numbers. If your audio player is portable, you'll want to get out of your car at each stop and listen to the tour at graveside. We'll begin our tour with one of Westview's most interesting residents, C.H. Jennison. All the more interesting because the person in the grave next to him isn't a person at all. In the early days of Westview Cemetery, the dearly departed arrived by horse-drawn wagon. The solemn clip-clop of hooves accompanied by the strains of a hymn were the somber notes of a funeral march. But when C.H. Jennison was delivered for his final rest, the march they played was, at his request, anything but restful. A tune called The Thunderer by John Philip Sousa. Before coming to Moultrie, Jennison was known as the King of Showmen and traveled the South as a band leader for circuses and other theatrical diversions. But after his arrival in 1908, he was known simply as Pop. He led the local concert band to regional fame and started a band at the high school, one of only 4 in the state at that time. The town built him a bandstand on the courthouse square, and his minstrel shows packed the local theater. But though he was lovingly called Pop by countless youth over the years, Jennison and his wife never had children of their own. Instead, they had a series of dogs. Jennison's attachment to his canine companion was so well known that the following notice appeared on the front page of the Moultrie Observer in 1944.
Perfect attendance record ends abruptly. Bobby, who hasn't been tardy or absent from school in years, has attended his last class. Bobby was the young Spitz breed dog owned by Mr. and Mrs. Jennison. He went to school every morning with Pop, the band director. A popular member of the class, Bobby made it his business to greet every boy and girl at the door daily. But Saturday night there was a big dog fight near the Jennison home. Pop rushed out as quickly as he could, but Bobby was lying dead in a ditch. Bobby was given a royal funeral by the Jennisons and high school students.
After Bobby came Trixie. Pop and Trixie went to the band hall together daily until Pop finally retired at the age of 70. Pop passed on a few years later and was sent marching across the Great Divide with a rousing graveside rendition of The Thunderer, played by a collection of his former students that spanned decades. And when Trixie's time came, she was placed at his feet, best friends for eternity. Pop Jennison expressed himself even beyond death with music. Some leave behind letters or place special instructions in their wills. But if you want your last impression to be a lasting impression, what better medium than granite? Pause your player and restart it when you've reached stop number 2, where we'll see some of Westview's most unusual headstones.
Stop number 2.
Here you can see 2 of Westview's more distinctive headstones. The first, marking the grave of Lee Chestnut, is in the shape of a heart. Clearly, Lee was loved. A few yards towards the back of the cemetery, you can see a child's headstone carved in the shape of a rocking horse. Elsewhere in the grounds is a marker carved like a beehive, and one for a World War II pilot shaped like wings. They're not on the tour, but they are marked on the map if you'd like to seek them out later. Such markers are charming, even whimsical, and can help to make cemeteries seem less forbidding. Still, many people find graveyards spooky, especially after dark, when the mind imagines all the frightful things that fill Hollywood horror films. Well, at our next stop, we'll meet a man who, in broad daylight, confronted the greatest wickedness history has ever known, looked evil in the eye, and brought it to justice.
Stop number 3.
Before the close of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin were at dinner together in Tehran, discussing what they should do with the Nazi military leaders after the war. Stalin proposed a radical approach: simply round up the 50,000 top-ranking enemy officers and shoot them. Not realizing that Stalin was actually serious, Roosevelt facetiously asked if shooting only 49,000 would do instead. Eventually, it was decided that the Nazis should be tried for their crimes against humanity. Those trials began in 1945 in Nuremberg, Germany. Captain Peter W. Walton, whose grave you see here, was part of the 5-man team that prosecuted Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, along with 17 of his German SS officers, who administered Nazi concentration and extermination camps. Even now, over half a century later, the charges Walton brought against Oswald Pohl and his subordinates can chill the blood. Forced labor, abuse of inmates, horrific medical experiments carried out on prisoners, in which they were infected with malaria and typhus, deprived of oxygen, frozen, sterilized, exposed to all manner of poison gases, poison foods, and even used as guinea pigs in tests of poison-carrying bullets. The Nuremberg Military Tribunal heard the case and rendered judgment. 2 of the lowest-ranking defendants were acquitted. 15 went to prison, many for life. Oswald Pohl went to the gallows and was hung to death. Peter Walton, having served his country and all mankind well, settled in Moultrie with his wife and enjoyed the freedoms for which his generation fought so bravely.
Stop number 4.
It's not hard to decipher the symbolism of Frank and Quinnell Bannister's headstones. In the center are wedding bells above the date on which they were married. Frank, on the left, spent 38 years as a fire chief. Quinnell spent the same number of years as an educator, thus an apple for the teacher. The symbolism of some other headstones in Westview is not so easy to decipher. The monuments at our next stop leave many people stumped, because they are, in fact, tree stumps carved from stone.
Stop number 5.
Have you noticed the many grave markers along this lane that are carved to resemble tree stumps? Each bears an inscription that identifies the grave's occupant as a member of the Woodmen of the World. What, you might ask, is this mysterious organization? A secret society of lumberjacks? Not a bad guess, since Colquitt County's first settlers came here primarily to harvest turpentine and lumber from the towering longleaf pines that cover the region. As it turns out, Woodmen of the World is a fraternity, but it's also a kind of insurance company. Born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1890 as a mutual aid society, the group would originally pass a hat for the benefit of individual members in their time of need. Later, the organization provided life insurance, which included coverage for the burial cost of its members. Lodges sprung up across the country, and members engaged in civic projects. The lodge in Moultrie is still active, and today the Woodmen of the World partner with the Red Cross to provide disaster relief and donate American flags to churches and schools. But among the most enduring legacies of the organization are the distinctive tree stump headstones that were an early benefit of Woodmen coverage and can be found in graveyards across the nation.
Stop number 6.
The lot before you is a special burial ground for Civil War veterans, created by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, whose local chapter has been active for over 100 years. At the start of the Civil War, or as some still call it, the War of Northern Aggression, there were just over 200 families in all of Colquitt County, and only 27 of them owned slaves. Folks here were more interested in timber than politics. When a statewide vote was called on the issue of secession, the county voted no. But a majority of Georgians felt otherwise. A state convention was called in Milledgeville. Local representatives were elected and sent, and once there, they signed the Ordinance of Secession, joining the state's other counties in exercising what they believed was Georgia's right to remove itself from the Union. The march to war had begun. Before it was over, those 200 families would contribute 139 men to the war, most of them married with children. On a spring day in 1862, the first group set out, marching 2 abreast north to Macon, leaving behind women and children who wept and worried that they would never see their sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers again. In all too many cases, those worries were confirmed. Before they even left their training camp in Macon, 13 of the group that came to be known as the Colquitt Marksmen succumbed to an outbreak of disease, most likely measles or smallpox. By fall, they faced enemy fire for the first time and lost more men at Crampton's Gap and at later skirmishes around Fredericksburg and Richmond. Winter brought a bitter cold that most of these South Georgia men had never experienced. 2 froze to death. More died at Chancellorsville under Stonewall Jackson, and then came the most infamous battle of them all, Gettysburg. After 2 terrible days of trying to dislodge Union troops from the high ground with assaults first on one flank and then the other, Robert E. Lee ordered General Longstreet to attack the center. Known to history as Pickett's Charge, it was a disastrous bloodbath. The Confederate casualty rate that day was over 50%, and the boys from Colquitt County were in the thick of it. Anyone who survived was lucky. One of those lucky men lies beneath one of the markers in this lot, though his inscription can no longer be read. Sergeant James Henry Dickens. He not only lived to tell of Gettysburg, but survived other deadly conflicts that followed: the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cedar Creek, and when Grant's army cut off Southern Railroad supply lines, Sergeant Dickens and the remaining Colquitt marksmen endured another brutal winter, suffering a dire shortage of clothing, blankets, and food. Sergeant Dickens' luck carried him through Lee's surrender at Appomattox, accompanied him on the long journey home, and stayed with him to the ripe age of 78. When he passed on in 1915, the local paper published the following tribute from a fellow Confederate.
Mr. Dickens, who died yesterday, was an old soldier, as brave a one as ever followed Lee. He was his regiment color-bearer, and in Longstreet's charge at Gettysburg he planted his flag 3 times upon Round Top, but could not hold the position on account of the overwhelming numbers of the enemy. I belonged to the same command and was with him at the time.
Others were not so fortunate as Sergeant Dickens. Of the total muster of 139 men from Colquitt County, 59 lost their lives during the war. Over half died from disease and exposure. The others met their end in battle or succumbed later from their wounds or the wretched conditions of enemy prison. You will notice that each Confederate soldier's grave is marked with a commemorative iron cross, whether they are buried in this lot or elsewhere in the cemetery. In 1960, as part of a statewide effort, the United Daughters of the Confederacy organized local citizens to canvass this and other county cemeteries. On an October day, 15 different memorial ceremonies were held simultaneously, complete with a reading of the names and motorcades to deliver an iron cross to each grave. The ceremonies were repeated in 2006 when the original crosses were replaced with new ones. There are over 200 Confederate graves across the county, 43 of them here in Westview. Many mark the remains of soldiers who were not originally from the area, but settled here after the war. One of them even started out as a Yankee. His name was R.C. Ingalls, and you'll find his marker in the middle row towards the left. 6 feet tall, with blue eyes, dark hair, and a fair complexion, Ingalls hailed from a family of prominent Illinois pioneers. But he held a belief in states' rights so fervent that at the age of 23, he left his Chicago home, headed south, and joined the Confederate Army. He fought in a Georgia regiment that saw action at many of the war's most horrific battles: Bull Run, Manassas, Chancellorsville, and the bloody massacre of Gettysburg. After the war, he made his home here. He was an educated man, versed in the classics, and he became a teacher during the Reconstruction era. Professor Ingalls, as he came to be called, even wrote a widely used arithmetic book called Factor and Product. Despite his superior education, life was hard for a community teacher. He received no salary, only a meager fee for each pupil, which was often hard to collect. So he supplemented his income with a bit of farming, and by copying and writing for less educated neighbors. The verse on his stone is from a popular poem of the 1800s by Iowa journalist J.L. McCreary.
There is no death. The stars go down to rise upon a fairer shore, and bright in heaven's jeweled crown they shine forevermore. There is no death. The earth we tread shall change beneath the summer showers, to golden grain or a mellow fruit or rainbow-tinted flowers. There is no death. An angel form walks o'er this earth with silent tread, and bears our dear loved ones away, and then we call them dead. But ever near us, though unseen, their angel forms do tread, for all God's universe is life. There are no dead.
Graceful young woman you see immortalized in pure white marble was born in 1895 and named Charlie Etta Burney after her father, Charles, who, we might surmise, was hoping for a boy. Despite her masculine name, Charlie Etta was pretty and popular, mentioned often in the social pages of the local newspaper. She was talented and educated too, having studied piano for 3 years at the prestigious Brunel College and Conservatory. After graduation, she returned home as one of the county's most eligible young ladies. So imagine the gossip that must have swept like fire through Wiregrass when, at dawn on a Sunday morning, she slipped out of the house alone, snuck off to the parsonage of the First Baptist Church, and married a handsome traveling salesman named Jack Henson. That same day, after breaking this shocking bit of news to her family, the newlyweds left for a honeymoon in the North Georgia mountains. By all reports, they were desperately in love, but the marriage would last for only 10 months. Just before her 23rd birthday, Charlie Etta Burney Henson went into labor, trying to deliver the babe you see in her arms. Neither mother nor child survived. Jack Henson, grieving for his beautiful young wife and their child, hired a photographer to capture their images in death, then sent the photographs to Italy, where a sculptor set their likeness in marble. But the story does not end there. Charlie Etta's father, a true pioneer of the South, as was his father before him, objected to his daughter and her baby being laid to rest beneath foreign stone. In their mutual grief, the two men reached a compromise worthy of Solomon. The grave itself was covered with a slab of native marble from the North Georgia hills where Charlie Etta had spent her honeymoon. The Italian marble statue stands to the head, and from this spot her image keeps vigil, facing east to witness the daily resurrection of the rising sun. But the monument that has seen more sunrises than any other in Westview is the headstone of Marion Darling, whose grave, at stop number 8, is the oldest in the cemetery. Let's go there now.
Stop number 8.
In the 1800s, the South was home to vast forests of towering long-leaf yellow pine. For the men who came to harvest them, those yellow pines were gold. Lumbering was the town's main business, and as you might expect, the men who ran the sawmills ran the town. Sawmills were dangerous places. There were any number of ways a man could lose an eye, or a limb, or a life. But when tragedy visited a sawmill operator named Darling, it was not at work, but at home. You see, the longleaf yellow pine tree was valued not only for its strength and the beauty of its narrow grain, but also for its highly flammable turpentine sap. The wood burns so hot and fast that it's commonly known as fatwood, and even today sticks of fatwood are reclaimed from old buildings and sold in fancy catalogs across America for use as kindling. Back then, not only were the town's fortunes built from this pine, so were its homes and businesses. Far more dangerous than a falling timber or a spinning saw blade could be a careless spark or a box of matches in the wrong hands. Those hands, in September of 1894, belonged to Darling's daughter, Marion, whose headstone lies before you here. But she did not, as you might expect, start a fire. She was only 9 months old. She ate the matches and died from the poison. The obituary in the local paper read as follows.
The parents received the sympathy of the whole community for the loss of their little one, whose remains were quietly laid away on a Sunday evening, surrounded by a large concourse of their friends and relatives.
Stop number 9.
This story revolves around a pretty young woman named Jenny McNeil. If you turn and look behind you a few yards towards the front of the cemetery, you can see the McNeil family plot. If a pioneering town could be said to have royalty, she would have been one of its princesses. One of Jenny's uncles was Major Neil McNeil, a personal friend of Robert E. Lee, there beside Lee during the surrender at Appomattox. Another of her uncles was W.C. Vereen, the closest thing the town ever had to a king. You can see the Vereen family lot just to the left of the McNeils. Vereen helped bring in the railroad, founded a grocery company, a cotton mill, a meat packing plant, and a uniform manufacturing company that is still one of the town's most important industries. He even founded the first bank, and when the Depression struck, his was the only bank to remain open continuously during the panic, with Vereen pledging his considerable personal fortune against anyone who wanted to withdraw his money. But when the McNeils and Vereens first arrived in the late 1800s, the newly incorporated town of Moultrie listed barely 50 souls on the census. Despite the limited pool of eligible bachelors, Jenny McNeil managed to find a suitable husband, a dashing young doctor named Ralph Lindsay. The Deep South at that time was not too different from the Wild West. Men carried guns, honor was sacred, and justice was swift. One evening about 9 o'clock, after heading home from his office to see his bride, young Dr. Lindsay found occasion to put his pistol to use. It seems he arrived home and found that Jenny was not alone. She had company, a young man named Perry Jenkins Williams, who, as stepson of the town's mayor, could also be described as a member of local royalty. His is the grave before you. The newspaper reports do not specify what Jenny and her visitor were up to, but state that what followed resulted from some infringement upon the sanctity of the home. What followed was that Dr. Lindsay shot Mr. Williams dead on the spot. The young doctor then retreated to his office and sent word to the police of what he had done. The coroner was summoned to hold an inquest, a jury was impaneled, and by 2 a.m. that same evening, they returned their verdict. Justifiable homicide, not guilty. Despite the shameful circumstances of his death, Williams's mother had him buried beneath the imposing monument you see here, topped by the statue of a beautiful young woman, which does seem a bit ironic, since a beautiful young woman was precisely what brought him to his untimely demise. Dr. Lindsay continued to practice medicine here for many years and is buried with his family nearby. As for his wife, Jenny, you need not look for her final resting place in Westview. After that scandalous night in 1906, she was never seen again. Did she flee? Was she banished? All who might know the answer are gone now, taking the secret with them to their graves.
Stop number 10.
Henry H. Kimball hailed from Boston. At age 23, he mustered into the Massachusetts Company G, 2nd Artillery Unit of the Union Army, along with another young man who was also named Henry H. Kimball, most likely a cousin. Their regiment headed south to defend Plymouth, North Carolina, an important Union Army supply depot on the Roanoke River. But in April of 1864, Confederate forces attacked. The Union Army held fast until the Southern Navy used the Albemarle, an ironclad ramming ship, to take control of the river. The Kimball boys and their fellow Union soldiers were surrounded. After 3 days of withering artillery, the rebel commander gave the men in blue an ultimatum: surrender or die. This was the response of Union General H.W. Wessels.
A surrender was demanded in consideration of my untenable position and the impossibility of relief. In failure of this, indiscriminate slaughter was intimated. This demand was refused.
The Southern armies attacked again with renewed vigor, pounding the fort from every angle, and soon the general was singing a different tune.
This condition of affairs could not be long endured without a reckless sacrifice of life, and in compliance with the earnest desire of every officer, I consented to hoist a white flag.
One of their Confederate captors, noting the somberness of the defeated Northerners as they marched single file to surrender their rifles, remarked that they looked like a bunch of pilgrims. The resemblance was not surprising, as these Massachusetts soldiers, marching out of a North Carolina fort called Plymouth, wore a distinctive hat quite similar to that of the original pilgrims who had first landed at a rock called Plymouth back in their home state. A captured Union soldier gave this recollection.
We were marched out between 2 lines of rebel infantry. They did us the honor to swap hats with us by taking them from our heads and substituting their own in place. I lost my tall dress hat, which had caught the eye of the Reb on account of the ostrich plume, which embellished it. I would have preferred keeping it, as it had 2 very ornamental bullet holes in the top, made by some complimentary rebel sharpshooting during the action.
Any sense of humor they might have had then would certainly desert them when they reached the Confederate prisons for which they were destined. Reports show that one of the 2 Henry H. Kimballs was herded into a boxcar and sent south, arriving 10 days later at the infamous military prison of Andersonville, Georgia, just 75 miles north from where you stand now. This hastily constructed stockade, intended to hold 10,000 men, was crammed with 3 times that many. A fetid stream that ran through the camp was both its water supply and its sewer. Disease ran rampant. 3 out of 10 men who entered the gates did not come out alive. We can be certain that the Henry H. Kimball who lies before you now was not the one at Andersonville. That one died of diarrhea just 3 months after his arrival. This Henry H. Kimball somehow survived his imprisonment. After the war, he married and eventually moved south for health reasons. Despite having fought for the Yankee invaders, he became a prominent local citizen and lived here until his death in 1905.
Stop number 11.
Some people love their cars. They polish them, name them, write songs about them. Mustang Sally, Pink Cadillac, Little Deuce Coupe. But few cars ever inspired more passion or ended up mentioned in more songs than the '57 Chevy. So it should come as no surprise that while most people in Westview are buried with their spouse or their parents or children, one man is heading for the great beyond with a picture of his favorite car, a '57 Chevy Bel Air carved right into his tombstone. Frank Jacobs had a thing for cars. He fixed up lots of them over the years, all kinds. But you never forget your one true love, even to your dying day.
Stop number 12.
On April 16, 1944, Staff Sergeant Richard King, radio operator of the 408th Bomb Squadron, was returning from a successful bombing mission over Indonesia. Spirits were undoubtedly high among the 11-man crew of the B-24J Liberator. They had survived the dangers of another run and would soon be back at base in New Guinea. On the hand that gripped the radio with which he communicated the plane's position, King wore an unusual class ring from Moultrie High School. Unusual because it was a woman's ring, and the 3 initials inscribed inside were not his. The ring and the initials belonged to a girl named Inez, who was waiting for him back home, nearly 9,000 miles away. It would not be accurate to say that their relationship had begun as a high school romance. Theirs was a grade school romance. By the time of high school graduation, their love was so certain that he ordered his class ring in her size, and she ordered her ring in his size. They exchanged the rings and a promise to always stay true. 2 years later, they exchanged wedding rings as well. But before children arrived, the Japanese paid a call on Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
King was drafted and found himself in the South Pacific bumping along in a B-24 bomber. Days before the mission, he had written Inez and, using a secret code they shared, had hinted that he would be going on this one last bombing run. But soon after she received his letter, she received a visit from 2 lieutenants bearing bad news. On the return flight, King's plane had run into a tropical storm and disappeared without a trace. He was declared missing in action. Desperately, she waited for word. She would wait for 62 years. In 2001, a hunter discovered a downed aircraft deep in the jungles of New Guinea. Military recovery crews found skeletal remains still wearing a woman's class ring from a little high school in a small town in South Georgia. On April 15th of that year, just 1 day shy of the anniversary of his mysterious disappearance, Richard King's remains were returned with full military honors to the native soil from which he sprung. His wife and childhood sweetheart, Inez, was there to see him make his final landing. This concludes our tour of Westview Cemetery. We hope that you enjoyed the experience and will consider making a contribution to help the Morning Glory Garden Club continue to preserve and beautify this historic site. Instructions on making a donation are on your map. Thank you. We hope you'll return soon, but only, of course, as a visitor.